Before I request our speaker to speak, I have a few announcements to make. Pardon me for bringing this coffee here. We are taking it outside. You'll get your tea and coffee after the talk. We have few announcements to make. Forthcoming programs of the Museum and Library. 9th December, today 6th, 9th December is a weekly seminar. Dr. Sana Iyer, MIT, USA, and must be she. She is going to speak on Khadi caps and Kenya Gandhi, transnational nationalism and diasporic politics. The second is on 10th of December, a weekly seminar. Dr. Himanshu Roy, fellow in this institute, and he will be speaking on Salva Judum, interrogating the state and the Maoists. Then the same day, at the same time, in the common room annex, there is a seminar led by Professor Ethan Kleinberg of Wesleyan University, USA, and he would be talking on history and theory in a global frame. Next day, 11 December, again here in this room, Dr. Samira Sheikh, Vanderbilt University, USA, and she will be talking on the go-between Laludas Desai and the politics of arbitration in early modern Gujarat. Besides these announcements, I have a list of occasional papers which have been released recently. Let me read them out for you. Each occasional paper costs 100 rupees and also available on the net. They are available here if you want to buy. In the History and Society series, we have two publications. One is by R.K. Deb Burma, Heroes and Histories, the Making of Rival Geographies of Tripura, 35 pages. Then David Lelyfeld, Sir Syed Maulana Azad and the Uses of Urdu. This is only 19 pages. These are in this series. The other series, Perspective in Indian Development, we have only one occasional paper by Pradeep Kumar Datta, Sriniketan's Cooperatives, the Possibilities and Dilemmas of Vishwabharati's Globality, 32 pages. In the series, Samaj Evam Itihas series, the first publication is by Anamika, Hindi ke Stri Sahitya ka Ushakal. The other one is Anirudh Deshpande, Cinema और इतिहास लेखन, संबंध और संभावनाएं. Pages are not mentioned here. The first one had 41 pages. And the website, Nehru Memorial has just, launched its website, www.nehrumemorial.nic.in. Let me repeat, www.nehrumemorial.nic.in. You can find all these occasional papers available on the net, free of charge, of course. The downloading cost is yours. Having said that, I have great pleasure of introducing Dr. D. Shyam Babu. When I read the announcement, I did not know that I know him so well. When I met him in the adjacent room, and I said, I have met you somewhere, then we started recalling our past. Then I found there several occasions that I have met him. It is my misfortune that my memory is failing now so much. I would say now that he is very old acquaintance and a good friend of mine. And he has been a journalist for many years, and only lately he is a senior fellow at Center for Policy Research, where he is working on this subject. And also there are other, you must have found out all the details. And his ongoing project is headed by Devesh Kapoor and Chandrabhan Prasad on Dalit entrepreneurs. But the present talk that he is going to deliver is how we fail social justice, the mismatch of constitutional provisions and institutional arrangements. The topic is very interesting. I have prepared some thoughts in my mind, and better I do not steal the thunder from the speaker, and I request the speaker now to please make his presentation. After the presentation, we'll have an open discussion, and then we can have more talk. Sir, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And once in a while, we have to thank our stars. So this is one of those days I thank my stars for my good fortune to come and speak here. One small regret is I really wish I had been sitting somewhere else and listening to people like my good friend Chandrabhan Prasad or Mr. Harish Khare. They are the people from whom I have been learning a lot. But it is my good luck I am here. Please indulge me. And this is also a great day, a memorable day in the sense today is the death anniversary of Dr. B.R. Ambedkar. And we also got the news that Mr. Nelson Mandela is no longer there. It is a day we should, in a way, celebrate the great contributions these great giants made towards social justice. The way they personified the kind of aspirations we all have as human beings, irrespective of our castes, religions, or races. So with that, let me go into my topic. See, the mismatch of constitutional provisions and institutional arrangements is a very big claim, and it's a very negative. So let me apply an antidote to pessimism that is indicative of my title. Social justice is all about creating a just society. It's always a journey, not a destination. In comparative terms, we can call one society as more just than others, like saying that Denmark is the best country to live in, etc. Or a society may be regarded as more just or unjust when it is compared with its own past. The second point is that when we evaluate India, we should remember that 6 decades is not too long a period for a society to sort out its centuries-old problems. The United States fought a bloody civil war 8 decades after its independence. However, we are undoubtedly right in quibbling about the direction of our journey. Is India's nation-building project on track? Whether the policy instruments we have chosen to redeem ourselves are effective enough, or are they counterproductive? We must also question the pace of progress. So, the devil is in the detail. As Barrington Moore observed nearly a half-century ago, India escaped or bypassed a revolution from the above and revolution from the below, and stuck with what he called the persistence of traditionalism. Since 1950, India has perfected the art of proving both pessimists and optimists wrong. Therefore, if India remains an odd case, even on the issue like social justice, it is not at all odd. And I am not tired of citing eminent jurist Nani Palkiwala's comment on what it means to be understanding India. When he was Indian ambassador to the United States, he once told his American audience that if you are not confused about India, that means you have not understood her. So if you think I am confused or confusing you, be assured that we are on track. Let me also clarify what I will not cover in my presentation. Since our topic is India specific, I will use conceptions and arguments that have traction here. For example, globally, labor welfare forms a major chunk of social justice, and that's why ILO is prominent in promoting the ideal. But for us in India, social justice is almost synonymous with caste justice. I will not attempt to summarize the vast philosophical discourse on justice, except highlighting John Rawls' definition of justice as fairness. His conception has become so universal that a layman like me also thinks justice in terms of fairness, and I will use justice and social justice as interchangeable. I will divide my presentation into two parts, in addition to a short introduction and even a shorter conclusion. In the first part, I will talk about practical and India-specific concerns with regard to social justice, how the very narrow conceptual lens we used since the Pune Pact and had resulted in a framework with too many holes to hold any water. In the second part, I will enumerate constitutional provisions aimed at creating a just society and also highlight institutional shortcomings. In other words, my contention is that India has been reactive rather than proactive on the need to create a just society. The country responds to challenges of equity and equality as occupational hazards. The dreams we had dreamt were not lofty enough to accomplish anything more substantial or praiseworthy. Dreams and visions are the seedlings of any change. As Yogi Berra said, if you don't know where you want to go, you will end up in somewhere else. What I will do now in the introduction is to explain how I view the whole project of social justice through two quotations. I do accept that choices are subjective. I am using them to communicate more clearly where I stand on various aspects of the subject. What do I mean by a just society? I have taken my conception from Prophet Isaiah in the Old Testament, who talks about true worship. I quote, "Is not this the kind of fasting I have chosen? To loose the chains of injustice and untie the cords of the yoke, to set the oppressed free and break every yoke? Is it not to share your food with the hungry and to provide the poor wanderer with shelter? When you see the naked, to clothe them, and not to turn away from your own flesh and blood." Unquote. The chains of injustice and the cords of the yoke. By the way, the Prophet also talks about mundane concerns like roti, kapda, or makan. What attracts me to his spiritual conception, however, is his stress on justice as a way of life, something reflexive, not as some kind of a centrally sponsored scheme. It is not whether justice is more important or less important than worship. Justice is worship. I have taken my second quote on India from Paul Brass, whose indictment of the country is severe and pertinent. He wrote this around 2002. Please bear with me. This is a long quote. Quote, "One needs also to open one's eyes to what denial of basic human needs of this population approaching 1 billion means. One has to keep before one's eyes what one sees every day in India and that one tends to forget almost instantly as one settles into the seats of the departing flights. People living in garbage dumps on the outskirts of cities from which they scavenge their food and clothing. Children lying listlessly on the grounds outside rural medical dispensaries where they have come because they have a flu or stomach ailment or perhaps something more serious and life-threatening. Their bodies covered with flies from head to toe, and no one there are interested in or capable of attending to them. Peasants tilling tiny plots of land insufficient to feed their families. Some of them still tied in relations of bonded labor to those with larger land holdings. Police raising their lathis against bicycle rickshaw drivers, sweltering in unbearable heat to beat them because they have made some minor traffic error. Old Muslim men walking up a hill to tell the mufti at the end of a right curfew how they were beaten by police, their beards grabbed and pulled, how they have lost sons in the riots, women telling their stories of husbands, sons, and brothers killed in the same riots, men sitting listlessly in government offices, doing absolutely nothing, hour after hour, day after day, the rich, privileged, and powerful sitting comfortably in their new bungalows, their five-star hotels, their restaurants, oblivious to all the above and prepared to deny that any of it actually exists in their country. Politicians moving about with guns in their holsters beneath their kurtas, with shadows and bodyguards. Ministers in the government moving about in retinues of cars, accompanied by smart-stepping black cats who run out to open their doors and surround them with their automatic rifles until they are safely inside their huge bungalows. I have many other such images in my mind's eye gathered over 38 years of personal observations, some of them too noisome to mention in print, which the phrase absence of sanitation does not capture even euphemistically. To refer to such things in a scholarly paper is to immediately elicit the following responses. Mother India, Drain Inspector's report, what about conditions in the United States? You have spent too much time in Uttar Pradesh, or simply silence, unquote. It's painful but true. I have sought to contrast between a lofty ideal, almost insurmountable by any society, and our abysmal failures as if we never tried. Therefore, during the next 25 to 30 minutes or so, I will do my best to put forward my central arguments. 1. At the time of independence, we embraced social justice as a political compromise, despite myriad provisions in the Constitution aimed at creating a just society. 2. That lackadaisical attitude resulted in the constitutional framework that even now appears more a mechanical addition than a functional one. And 3. Institutions that were envisaged in the Constitution have come into neglect and abuse. The result is, despite an extensive scheme of social justice in India, the country's performance in social development has been as if it has not had any provisions at all. In the 2013 World Happiness Ratings, India finds itself at 111th position, sandwiched between Hungary and Mauritania. Part 1. What went wrong? In 1936, in his seminal work, The Annihilation of Caste, Dr. Ambedkar declared, Indians are not a nation. They are only an amorphous mass of people. He expressed the same view in the Constituent Assembly in November 1949. I quote, in believing that we are a nation, we are cherishing a great delusion. How can people divided into several thousands of castes be a nation? The sooner we realize that we are not as yet a nation, in the social and psychological sense of the word, the better for us. For then only we shall realize the necessity of becoming a nation and seriously think of ways and means of realizing the goal, unquote. I hope you will agree with me that it is still relevant in 2013 to ask the question, have we, as Indians, succeeded in becoming a nation in which other identities and loyalties are subordinate to the national identity? Conversely, is caste still an impediment to nation building? I believe that caste is a big impediment even now to our nation building. Cricket alone cannot create a spirit of nationhood where we develop a sense of bonding. After three cardinal principles that came out of the French Revolution, liberty, equality, and fraternity, we have done relatively well with regard to the first two and hoped that fraternity would automatically follow. But political liberties and economic well-being have not created fraternity, and more importantly, that failure has come to affect our gains in the first two as well. Hence the question, where have we gone wrong? Basically, we were too timid to dream visions of radical social transformation as the first necessary step towards nationhood. What do I mean by our timidity? Dr. Ambedkar took the stand that caste was a pernicious institution and rejected it lock, stock and barrel. But the Indian mainstream conception was something like caste was essentially good and natural, and it developed certain infirmities which could be and must be rectified. Radical social transformation took place in many countries as a result of revolutions, probably with the significant exceptions of Britain and the United States. However, social change through reform suffer from one handicap. Those who are in a position to affect change are more likely to prefer status quo. Arguments like change with continuity and peaceful transformation would become, as they did, justifications for perpetuating entrenched interests. Since 1952, the country is torn between the demands from below for social change and the ruling elite's desire to preserve cultural uniqueness. Our elite believed that tradition and modernity could coexist. For example, Dr. Ambedkar cites W.C. Banerjee's defense of tradition in his presidential address at the Lucknow session of the Congress in 1892. To the cheers of the crowd, I quote, "I, for one, have no patience with those who say we shall not be fit for political reform until we reform our social system. I fail to see any connection between the two. Are we not fit for political reform because our widows remain unmarried and our girls are given in marriage earlier than in other countries? Because our wives and daughters do not drive about with us visiting our friends? Because we do not send our daughters to Oxford and Cambridge?" Unquote. This is no anecdotal comment. The same sentiments Mr. Banerjee expressed contributed to Dr. Ambedkar's resignation from Nehru's cabinet 6 decades later in 1951, following the controversy on Hindu Code Bill. The elite also believed that any stress on social reform would weaken the fight against the British rule. This became a major concern once the country had entered the era of elections after 1909, which degenerated into a national paranoia with the communal awards in the early 1930s. And here I am not referring to several vibrant social reform movements during the 19th and early 20th centuries in several states such as Maharashtra, Kerala and others. Despite their transformative potential, most of these reforms remained local, confined to sometimes castes. They never came up to the national level to have a meaningful contribution in the framing of the Constitution or the way we came up with policies. That's the reason I'm skipping that part. And the anti-Brahmin movement in the South falls in a class of its own. Though it also focused on social reform, the movement was always a platform for assertion by Shudra castes who sought equality vis-a-vis Brahmins but neglected to extend the same equality to the Dalits. I will come back to a discussion on the legacy of this movement behind the present troubles we face with social justice. This was the setting at the time of independence. India's destiny had fallen in the hands of national leaders who were products of colonial modernity but rooted in tradition. And perhaps the sole exception to this is Dr. Ambedkar. And for these leaders, independence would take care of all problems. As I mentioned, ironically, most national leaders did not regard caste as a pernicious institution affecting all sections. They did recognize how it was responsible for the plight of Dalits. Therefore, they were in favor of some safeguards as incorporated in the Constitution. By the time we were framing the Constitution in the late 1940s, social justice was regarded as atoning for the injustices meted out to the Dalits. That's why we were justifying the constitutional safeguards for Dalits as compensated discrimination or protective discrimination. That was appropriate, but my contention is twofold. One, the Harijan upliftment was proved to be a narrow foundation to build a just social order. For some, it was a charity towards the most dispossessed, beneficial and hence relevance only to the recipients. For others, it was a political price they had no option but to pay for the sake of unity of Hindu society. Gender justice, for example, had no place in this framework. My second contention follows from the first. Despite the universalist language adopted in the fundamental rights, caste was relied on as the sole reference point to promote social justice. But that's not how the Constituent Assembly approached the task. It was reluctant to extend any safeguards to groups other than Dalits and tribals on the basis of ethnicity. It termed all other claimants as other backward classes. Consider what happened subsequently and how it still affects us. Into this timid and uncertain project had entered two new factors. They were new in the sense the constitution makers did not endorse them, at least in the shape they came to assume in subsequent decades. The first factor is the Shudra assertion on caste lines and how that assertion got legitimized through legal and institutional mechanisms. From the late 1960s onwards, this contributed to electoral fragmentation, leading to political instability, not so much through frequent change of governments, but by robbing the country of political and social consensus. As Pratap Bhanu Mehta pointed out, Shudra assertion was only an anti-upper caste movement and not anti-caste movement. Another trouble that the Shudra assertion has brought on us is what may be called the Mandalization of our society. When Mr. Lalu Prasad Yadav won assembly elections in Bihar, a respected journal like the Economic and Political Weekly carried a commentary with the title, Victory for Social Justice. What is wrong with it is well articulated by Dipankar Gupta, who contrasted Mandal project's potential to create fraternity with Ambedkar's project. I quote, Ambedkar had a larger social program, namely that of enhancing fraternity among citizens in a free, sovereign republic. According to this vision, castes would gradually cease to make any difference in public life. Mandal's trust was really much more limited. What mattered most to him was to ensure that members of such a designated backward castes got jobs and seats in educational and other institutions. Caste, in the case of Mandal Commission, is an important political resource to be plumbed in perpetuity. The Mandal program is not in the spirit of enlarging fraternity as the Ambedkar proposals are, unquote. The second factor is how we bent the liberal framework that the Constitution had provided in 1950 and converted it into a socialist project. My purpose here is not to favor one ideology over the others. In so far as realizing social justice is concerned, my submission is this shift had several implications. First, the creation of Planning Commission had resulted in centralized planning as an extra constitutional enterprise. In fact, the Constitution merely lists economic and social planning in the concurrent list. Central planning enabled the center to encroach upon the state's prerogatives. I will deal with this point a bit more in the next section. The second implication is that the presence of states, the all-powerful Leviathan, stifled private initiative in crucial areas like education, health, etc. I am not using private initiative in business sense, but in social sense. The third implication of the state-centric system is the emergence of all-pervasive culture of dependence and the competition among all sections to project themselves as poor and in need of state patronage. Even industrialists and business houses are not immune to this dependence. Therefore, we started our journey in 1950 with many handicaps. Caste was and still is an impediment to India maturing into a nation. Our stress on preserving cultural uniqueness severely curtails our visions and dreams. Added to these are the reaction of caste and the politics of welfare state. It is a toxic mix of inherited weaknesses and self-inflicted wounds. It is no wonder that our performance in creating a just society is anything but spectacular. In the second part, I will deal with the constitutional scheme and the institutional framework. The Constitution of India received almost universal acclaim because of its redeeming features on social and economic development, which were thought to be innovative and radical. Commenting on the objectives resolution, Jawaharlal Nehru said, I quote, "The resolution was something more than a resolution. It is a declaration, a firm resolve, a pledge, an undertaking, and for all of us, a dedication." Unquote. However, the Constitution did not invent the social justice framework, but inherited it partly from the British experience and partly from the princely states. The latter legacy is the problematic for us. In my discussion, I will broadly confine to provisions that relate to the welfare of Dalits and tribals. Certain universal rights, human rights if you will, were granted to all citizens as fundamental rights, such as equality in a comprehensive manner, basic freedoms, and even the right to seek court's intervention to have one's fundamental rights implemented. Rights of the minorities were protected. Above all, untouchability stands abolished. These are all negative rights. That is, the state is obliged to act only when a right, say, right to freedom of expression is denied to a citizen. There are additional safeguards with regard to the scheduled areas and scheduled tribes. In fact, the constitutional framework with regard to the scheduled areas and scheduled tribes is quite radical. In the sense, the governor has the powers to withhold the implementation even of a central law. He has the power to extend the operation of a law not from that state, from a different state. He can extend that law to be operational in his state. The trouble with this is it is never implemented. So with that kind of radical framework, there are three aspects to social justice with regard to these two groups. One is representation, the second is human rights, the third is economic and social development. Representation is basically job reservations and representation in the legislative bodies. There is a misconception that they are temporary and valid only for 10 years. Job reservations are always, from the beginning they are permanent. What is temporary is the political reservations in the legislature. They also have become permanent in the sense they have been extended for every 10 years and there is no prospect of their being discontinued. The human rights angle, you have untouchability abolished, you have landmark legislation like PCR Act of 1955 and the Atrocities Act of 1989. The implementation part is problematic there. The third pillar of the social justice triad is the provisions for educational and economic development. And most of these provisions are found in Part 4 in the Directive Principles of State Policy. They are non-justiciable. And I think it is done by the framers of the Constitution deliberately. These are just exhortations, not directives to that extent. And the constitutional makers apparently did not see the need to create an institutional mechanism to ensure the proper implementation of these provisions. There are only two exceptions to this. One is the creation under Article 338 of the Office of the Special Officer, which was changed into National Commission. And the second is the provision to have ministers in charge of tribal development in states like Madhya Pradesh, Orissa, and Bihar. And later these provisions extended everywhere. But the constitutional scheme, complex as it is, raises several questions as to the coherence of the welfare regime, its implementation, and the safeguards to safeguard the safeguards. And these questions are not peculiar to this subject, but inform the whole constitutional scheme. Lacunae in federal structure, mismatch between powers and responsibilities among the state, center, and local bodies, and the erosion of bureaucratic neutrality have all adversely affected the quality of governance. Poor governance is more a problem for the poor than any other section. And despite the extensive framework for the welfare of Dalits and tribals, there is no direct mention of these provisions in the 7th schedule that contains the three lists: union list, state list, and concurrent list. These lists are extensive. There are about 210 main items containing more than double that number of areas that encompasses all activities under the sun. The items from important areas such as defense of India, atomic energy, foreign affairs, war and peace, to trivia such as lighthouses, lotteries, burial and cremation grounds, betting and gambling, inns and innkeepers, etc. Following are the only items in the three lists with very limited relevance to social justice. Union list does not contain even a single item related to social justice. In state list, we find public health and sanitation, relief of the disabled and unemployable, relief of agricultural indebtedness. The concurrent list has these provisions: vagrancy, nomadic and migratory tribes, economic and social planning, social security and social insurance, welfare of labor, employment and unemployment. In early 90s, when the 73rd and 74th amendments came into being, the situation has improved somewhat. The 11th schedule, specifying powers and responsibilities of the village bodies, contains this provision: welfare of the weaker sections, and in particular of the scheduled castes and the scheduled tribes. It can be argued, therefore, that only local bodies are now constitutionally mandated to strive for the welfare of Dalits and tribals. Now, I have two distinct complaints on the way the constitutional system has evolved over years. My first complaint is that the way welfare state has come to monopolize the whole discourse on social justice is a constitutional hearsay. It was not meant to be that way. The founding fathers put negative rights on firm footing as fundamental rights. They relegated matters on social and economic development to mere exhortations, and for a good reason. As a whole, fundamental rights guarantee the basic fruits of good governance: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. In an ideal world, both negative and positive rights should enjoy equal importance. We should be able to eat the cake and have it too. But there is a trade-off. Consider, for example, the Scandinavian welfare states. They are the best examples of social justice in practice. They have succeeded in going beyond the absolute minimum: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, plus several other good things. Our peculiar problem in India is that we have failed to afford life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness to all, and we also keep on promising several good things of life. Am I opposed to the state taking care of social justice, helping the poor and vulnerable? No. Welfare politics also provides an escape route to the government. Take a typical case of an atrocity on Dalits. It would be always politically inconvenient, even dangerous, to punish the perpetrators and implement the human rights of the victims. What is the way out? Announce ex gratia payment, government jobs to the kin of those killed, payment cash, etc. I am in favor of ex gratia help, but over and above justice. A state that fails in its police functions cannot hope to do so many other things. Why not improve police functions and also keep dispensing social justice? One problem we have come to regret is that welfare politics have not only created a culture of dependence, but brought back caste in a big way. It is a setback to Ambedkar's project of casteless society. We can have several examples of how social justice has become a political project, actually an electoral project. I have extensive feedback from the grassroots, in our field trips in UP villages and also other states, myself and my good friend Chandraban Prasad have encountered several questions from people, and we had no answers. A Dalit father in Western UP asked us on midday meal scheme. I quote, "Sir, is the food my child gets in the school all that she eats in the whole day? She gets all 3 meals. We do provide food. What we want but unable to get is English education." Unquote. A few years ago, I carried out an exercise along with 2 of my colleagues to examine what explains atrocities. Are poorest and illiterate among Dalits are subject to violence? What we have found is that violence is directed at relatively well-off and educated Dalits. In other words, upward mobility of Dalits is still unacceptable. So far, my point has been this. The Constitution sought social justice as a byproduct of good governance, not a template for governance. The second point is that since the template was never a well-thought-out system, it is now a case of too many cooks spoiling the broth. The institutional structure consists of ministries, departments, national commissions, parliamentary committees, finance, and development corporations, etc. I have one sentimental issue. I am not against institutional innovation. Why not a new national commission to address a new concern? Why not a new policy? The trouble is, our basic assumption in creating new structures is that the good old line departments are ineffective. Agreed. Are the new institutions given powers and autonomy to discharge their responsibilities? No. All the national commissions come under the administrative control of the same structures. They are supposed to complement and correct. Most of them are underfunded, understaffed, and completely ignored. It's a facade. We can tick a few boxes here and there and claim we have a system in place. Now I would like to flag a few important points with regard to institutional insufficiency. 1. Consider the case of governors in states with scheduled areas and tribal population. As I mentioned earlier, in 63 years, not even one single governor exercised any of the powers vested in him by the Constitution. Point number 2. The office of the special officer, originally envisaged in Article 338, now has resulted in 2 national commissions, one for the Dalits and other for tribals. We also have several other commissions. Under Article 338, these commissions should be consulted in all policy formulations that have a bearing on the target group, and it has never been done. Their annual reports are not tabled in Parliament even after years. By taking refuge under a clause to submit an action taken report. My third complaint is, there is a kind of diarchy in matters related to social justice. Responsibilities are entrusted to the institutions specially created, and powers are held by regular line ministries. For example, on matters related to atrocities on Dalits, the Ministry of Social Justice and Empowerment is the nodal ministry, but matters related to law and order are held by the Home Ministry. It is another matter that the whole issue is a state subject. According to Ajit Majumdar, most areas that directly affect people are the responsibilities of the states, while the central controls financial powers. So the question we have no answer for is this. If the Home Ministry fails to do or doesn't care to protect Dalits from violence, what new institutions can do the job? If governance fails at a fundamental level, unable to ensure life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, special provisions and institutions cannot succeed. If the society doesn't believe in justice and fraternity, the state cannot say, let there be social justice. This is something Dr. Ambedkar feared a long time ago. This is my basic argument on social justice. By way of conclusion, I'll take a couple of minutes. Probably many of you might be wondering why I haven't really mentioned about reservations. We have come to regard reservations as the sole anchor of our social justice project. My question is, it is fine to have reservations because reservations are evidence of full citizenship for the Dalits and tribals. But my point is, when you don't have jobs, what use job reservations? What helps social justice and the weaker sections is good governance. It is much more important for the weaker sections if you provide them good policing. It's such a, we feel it is such a small or a trivial matter. When a villager comes to Delhi to find a livelihood, what is his problem here? Harassment by police. He can't even go to police or anybody for help. His basic fundamental rights are not ensured. What we learned last year in the case of Nirbaya's atrocity, police don't take action. If we don't fix the basic governance problem, there is no point in talking about lofty ideals, creating great institutions, making more laws. And this I am not saying as a justification to demand another Administrative Reforms Commission to think how we are going to make changes at a very grand level. It's basically nuts and bolts of governance that matter to the poor people. And there is one aspect of reservations we never talk about. We talk about these job reservations for the weaker sections. A few years back, myself and my friend Chandravan Prasad went to Railway Ministry to find out what prevents the Railway Ministry from allocating some catering jobs in the trains like Rajdhani to Dalit entrepreneurs. The response we got, the details rather, is that there are so many entry barriers created only to help the rich and powerful. If you want to take a contract to maintain a pantry car in one train, the requirements are like you need to have a turnover of 5 crores in the last 5 years. And there are so many other things. You should have registered your company some 15 years ago. So with the result, it's not just Dalit entrepreneurs. Even small people, even a Brahmin, a poor Brahmin cannot survive. But despite this, we counted more than 1,000 big Dalit entrepreneurs who came on their own thanks to the economic reforms initiated in 1991. Despite all the complaints we have against them, there are so many shortcomings, but the openings and the opportunities these people have been able to make use of, so much so that according to latest government reports, Dalit entrepreneurs are now providing more employment opportunities than the total number of jobs given to them under reservations. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Dr. Babu. The points that you made in your conclusion are very critical, and I hope there will be many questions on those things, particularly the way you put the case for a liberal economy.